historical text from the exact time of the Garden Palace, and it was from a supplement from the International Exhibition. So this was how Australia was presenting itself to the world. This was how Australia was talking about Aboriginal people. And it really is that point that so many Aboriginal people, from that point onwards and into the future, we've been fighting to turn the tables, to kind of shift that dialogue around. And in fact, today we're lucky to have Tasha Lamb, who in fact is part of this group of people who are actively trying to take on that historical narrative and shift it. And it's a historical narrative that I'm not sure will go away. It's a historical narrative that is deeply embedded within us, that we have to think about, and that is very much part of our conscious decisions of working in spaces like this. And so as I said, Tash is one of these people working in this area. Tash is a Wiradjuri sister girl there from Wiradjuri country in Dubbo, who I've been lucky enough to work with, who's had a really extraordinary kind of connection with collections. Prior to working here, Tash was down at IATSIS, working with the collection engagements there, an extraordinary body of collections again, working with communities from right across the country. As mentioned before, I was lucky enough to work with Tash last year on the Byalanura exhibition, which I'd encourage you all to have a look at during your lunch break. And I've been really impressed with Tash and the way thinking about how to access these points and how we can actually make museums safe spaces. So please welcome Tash to the stage to talk about some of those ideas.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning. It's so nice to see you all here. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land we meet on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would also like to pay my respects to all elders past and present and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. My name is Tasha Lamb. I am a Wiradjuri woman who has family ties covering all areas and language groups of New South Wales. My homelands are along the Bogan River in central west New South Wales. This is where my ancestors have lived, cared for country, culture, and each other for thousands of years. And this spirit continues through me and my family. I am here because of my ancestors. I work here at the Australian Museum and I feel very privileged to work here close with, a large and significant collection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander materials. I have the opportunity to share my culture and stories with others through my work in public programs and exhibitions. Is it working? Yeah. As we've mentioned today, the Australian Museum is the first museum and the oldest museum in Australia. This is an early picture, the earliest picture known, dating around the 1850s of the original entrance. So if you're wondering where that may be, as where you've come in today at the Crystal Hall, it would have been to your right. But what you would have noticed is that the columns are missing, and Kim actually told me a pretty cool fact today that they were removed and they're now in Centennial Park. For many years, the Australian Museum was the only museum in colonial Australia. Although its primary collecting interest was in zoology and geology, it also acquired cultural objects relating to the early history of European exploration and colonisation of Australia. The beginnings of the museum's collection cannot be precisely dated. It is believed that most likely the museum already had some collections when William Holmes was appointed as museum keeper in 1829. The collections did not become accessible for public viewing until 1832, and it wasn't until another 3 years later Dr. George Bennett, who was the museum secretary and curator, set out to extend the collections and presided over the acquisitions of the first native weapons. At this time, Thomas Mitchell, Surveyor General New South Wales, undertook a journey to trace the course of the Darling River to the Murray. He charted long sections of my country along the Bogan River and to the Darling River, where he encountered Aboriginal people and took with him some cultural objects. These cultural objects were a total of 23 artefacts, which he later donated to the Australian Museum. These objects are believed to be the first Aboriginal cultural materials in the Australian Museum collection since it was established in 1827. This was the birth of the Australian Museum's anthropology collections. During the early years of European settlement, and the world's oldest culture was being destroyed, Aboriginal people were being removed from their homelands in an attempted genocide. The frontier wars were sweeping across southeast Australia, leaving behind in the aftermath shields, spears and other objects that our people used, which later became quite valuable to the settlers for trade. These objects were often used to justify popular scientific theories of that time, such as social Darwinism, and that these objects were the physical evidence of a culture that was dying out. Many of these cultural objects were collected and put on display at world fairs such as the Sydney International Exhibition in 1879 at the Garden Palace. I think everyone's familiar with the ethnological court. The Australian Museum displayed 2,000 items in the ethnological gallery of the Garden Palace, alongside smaller collections loaned from other Australian colonies and private individuals. For this, the museum was awarded the first degree of merit for presenting the finest ethnological collection in the Sydney International Exhibition. Amongst the Australian Museum's collections were mostly from New Guinea and Melanesia. 359 of the 2,000 had Australian localities, but this number is only an estimate, as catalogue records were not always accurate. Amongst these objects were boomerangs, spears, bark paintings, shields, stone axes, and cultural objects that were collected earlier by Thomas Mitchell from my Wiradjuri country. The Sydney International Exhibition was a huge success and was seen by over 1 million people in such a short time it was open. Before the exhibition was closed in April 1880, the Australian Museum curator Edward Ramsay recommended that the museum purchase or acquire by exchange the collections of the other exhibitors, but only a few entries in our registers around this time correspond with the catalogue listing. The Australian Museum's collection remained in the Garden Palace building to become part of the museum's new branch venture, the Technological, Industrial and Sanitary Museum of New South Wales. But just weeks before it was due to open, in September 1882, as we now know, a catastrophic fire destroyed everything. The greatest loss of cultural materials from Southeast Australia is still felt by communities today. Southeast Aboriginal communities who want to access the Australian Museum's cultural collections today to connect with their cultural heritage feel very disheartened when they find out that these invaluable cultural materials had been destroyed. From the 1870s, a great deal of colonial collecting was directed towards exhibitions like the Sydney International. This fact affected all Australian museums, particularly Sydney, prompting the curators to establish contact with collectors on the frontiers of European and Aboriginal contact. The origins of the European Museum clearly lie with the Cabinet of Curiosities, and there are still a few museums around the world that echo this approach. The representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in museums has long been through objects that were seen as relics of the past and often displayed in a typological clusters to comparatively show the evolution of man from primitive through to civilised. The Cabinet of Curiosities speak more of earlier collectors' preoccupation and preconceptions about the world and their place in it, rather than they do about the items that they contain. In the current museum environment, there is a steadily increasing engagement with communities of origin that involves a redefinition of roles and responsibilities and the development of new processes of commitment between museums working together with Indigenous communities. collections are also becoming more accessible. What is collected in one period of time may become iconic in another. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have long emphasised the continuity of knowledge and the enduring care of particular ceremonial items and other cultural materials. It is simply that the scope of collections and the manner in which they are obtained, managed and used is being redefined. Indigenous curators bring a new dimension of knowledge and comprehension to how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture is represented in exhibitions. Some museums still present our cultural objects in a dated ethnographic way. It can be so frustrating to see our culture misrepresented in exhibitions and undervalue the true complexity of our culture. How can cultural collections remain relevant today if there's no engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? This image is of our Gurragurang exhibition, which you can have a look at our lunch break. The Gurragurang Sea Country looks at the relationship and stories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander saltwater people and coastlines. It was the first exhibition within the Australian Museum told from an Indigenous perspective, incorporating Aboriginal languages, knowledges and worldviews within the interpretation of objects. So I just want to talk now about some of the ways that the Australian Museum are collaborating with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities through our programs. Okay. So here is an image of family members of my own. Before I go into the background of that, I'll just go on. The nature of the relationships between collections and communities is becoming more and more complex. The complexity is in part about histories. It is also about sharing and knowledges associated with the collections. There are the issues of handling objects with cultural sensitivities and concerns such as the repatriation of skeletal and ceremonial materials, authorial interpretation and advocacy. Maintaining cultural heritage by providing access to information and increasing understanding, giving Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people a voice in the ways that they are represented in exhibitions, especially in how our stories are told, assisting with self-sufficiency and employment, and knowledge exchange supporting that of community museums through our outreach programs and the repatriation of cultural materials. So these images are of my Uncle Roy Barker and his two sons. Uncle Roy was a senior carver and knowledge keeper, a proud Murrawari man. He was the son of a Wiradjuri woman who was my great-great-grandmother's sister. She was taken away from her homeland on the Bogan River at Bulgandra and removed to Brewarrina. Uncle Roy passed away in 2012, a few weeks after his wife Auntie June did. This bark canoe, and I'll show you now, his bark canoe that he made with his sons is one of the last works he made for the Australian Museum Cultural Collections. When I was working with the exhibition by Ala Nurayani Country, I was adamant that we really needed to include this canoe in the exhibition. It wasn't about my personal connection with it, but it was what it represents. It represents our people's continuous connection with country and culture, the resilience of a culture that has had many attempts of eradication. Have I just missed one? Sorry, I think I just missed a slide. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are using the materials held in cultural collections to reconnect, activate, reawaken and revitalise cultural practices. They are also using these cultural objects to learn more about their cultural heritage. Recently I hosted a group of Aboriginal women weaving group at the Australian Museum. The women are learning the skills of weaving and reconnecting with their culture. They are from many areas of New South Wales and were very interested in seeing what weaving collections we had from New South Wales. I presented to them some woven bags from the Bundock collection, which is from Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales. And here's an example of it now, which actually is in the Gurragurang exhibition, so you can see it today, but Rebecca Fisher will also have some other items from that collection that you can look at up close. So when I invited the women in to look at the collections, they were in awe. There was total silence. There was 20 of them, and usually when we're doing our weaving groups, there's yarning going on, laughing, but they were just amazed to actually be in the presence of this cultural object. One woman said that she felt the energy of her ancestors in there, and another was inspired to learn more about how to learn the style of this weave. These historical collections are from our past, but they also represent our present. For some people, our identity and culture are linked to these objects. They are tangible connections to our ancestors and embody the cultural connection we have to our history and to our reality. As Aboriginal people, we relate to cultural materials in a way that is so special that we see these objects as beings. We have a deep spiritual connection to these materials, and they carry the DNA of our ancestors and the DNA of country, where they come from. So I want you to think about when we're weaving, you're using your hands. From using your hands, the oils that you transfer onto the fibres that you are weaving, these oils contain our DNA. We become part of the object. When you think about how people, Aboriginal people, use, things like hair or teeth within these objects, we're making these objects, we become part of them, they're embedded in these materials. Oh, so that's the group of the ladies when we were weaving in the park. Here's an example of what we made that day. Okay, so this is where I wanted to share with you my personal connection to the collection here at the Australian Museum. When I first met Jonathan Jones when we were working on the Byalanura exhibition, when he found out that I was a sister girl to him and that I was from the Bogan River area, he told me he was obsessed with these objects. He was going on and on and on about these Bogan picks and that I have to see them. I had no idea, it wasn't what I expected, but he did tell me that they were in our collection and I needed to see them. So we made the appointment, we went in, we had a look at them. He then told me that, these Bogan picks are the clues into how Aboriginal people cultivated the land, and that this exact Bogan pick is from where I'm from where my ancestors are. So when we made the appointment and had a look, when I saw it, I just thought, oh, it's just a stone. I didn't identify, there was no carvings, there was no paintings, nothing that looked familiar to identify for me that it actually was from my country. Then I started to look more closely and I noticed the provenances of where they were from. The places that were recorded on them were from areas that, I've heard my, grandparents talk generations and generations, these areas that I'm connected to. It became very exciting and I thought to myself, what if, the possibility of an ancestor actually making this tool? So I had to touch it, I had to ask. I know working in a museum we always have wearing our gloves, but this time I was allowed to touch it with my hands, my bare hands. So it was this one in particular that's marked with Bogan River. And I have to say, when I held it, the Bogan pick in my hand was like holding the hand of my ancestor. I can't explain the energy of what I felt, but the only thing I can say is like what I felt was that instant connection to what I thought was just stone. So I thank you, Jonathan, for showing me that, and I'll never forget it. So before I end, I just want you to think a little bit about the Garden Palace fire and what was lost and the resilience of a culture. But maybe the fire wasn't accidental. Maybe it was the way of the ancestors that these cultural objects were not to be owned by others or held captive or put on display, but they were to be returned to the earth where their whole existence came from back to country. Thank you.